current governor of the South African Reserve Bank. And of course, we've got Professor Tooze from Columbia University, an eminent historian and economist. This conversation, facilitated by Prof Valodia, promises to be a fascinating one. It brings together two distinguished experts with diverse backgrounds and experience. Just to tell you briefly about our guests, and here are their biographies. I will not go into any detail because of time, but I think it behoves me just say a few words about them for those of you that are not familiar with who they are, in particular for the young audience here. Governor Lesetja Kganyago was appointed governor of the South African Reserve Bank with effect from the 9th of November 2014, reappointed by the President of the Republic for the second 5-year term starting on the 9th of November 2019. He is the chairperson of the Monetary Policy Committee and the Financial Stability Committee. And prior to that, he served, of course, as Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank from the 16th of May in 2011 until his elevation to his current position. He chairs the committee of the Central Bank Governors of Southern Africa in the Southern African Development Community, SADC region, co-chairs the Financial Stability Board's regional consultative group for Sub-Saharan Africa, and chairs the Financial Stability Board Standing Committee on Standards Implementation. Now, the key one here is that he serves as the chairperson of the International Monetary and Financial Committee, which is a primary advisory board to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. I mean, that's a real big one. South African chairing that international body from the July 2018 up until 27 February 2021. That speaks volumes about the international acclaim with which Governor Lesetja Kganyago is held by the international community. He holds an MSc in economics from School of Oriental and Applied School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, and a Bachelor of Commerce in economics and accounting from the University of South Africa. Thank you, Professor Dr. Mr. Kganyago, for being here. Also, we'd like to introduce Professor Tooze as well. He holds the Shelby Cullen Davis Chair of History at Columbia University and serves as a director of the European Institute. In 2019, the Foreign Policy magazine named him as one of the top global thinkers of the decade. His latest book, Shutdown, How the COVID Shook the World Economy, is on sale now. He's, of course, well known for coming with this concept of how to manage the world in the era of polycrisis, which became a topic, and I was privileged to have had the opportunity to privilege these conversations at Davos this year on the polycrisis and the fragmentation. He's a fluent German speaker, which is quite unusual for a native speaker. That's quite impressive. He had a bit of German earlier on. And Professor Tooze has appeared on PBS television, BBC radio, Norddeutsche Rundfunk, the History Channel, Swiss and French television. In February 2011, Adam served as the Thomas Hawkins Johnson's visiting professor in military history at the American Military Academy, otherwise known as West Point. Among his books, he has written books on statistics and the German state, the making of the modern economic knowledge, which appeared in 2011, The Great War and the Remaking of the Global Order, 1916 to 1931, in 2014. With these books, Adam won the Leeuwenhoek Prize Fellowship, the H. Soskus Hütte Book Prize, and the Longman History Today Prize, among others. It's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Valodia to have a conversation with two eminent scholars, leaders in their own right, from two different geographies and with two different histories. I look forward to this, what will be an incredibly exciting conversation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor. So we planned this kind of event as a come really as a conversation between Professor Tooze and the governor. My task here is to come really just chair and to kind of steer the conversation. When we kind of planned this with the governor and Professor Tooze, I don't think any one of us, I can certainly put myself in that, had heard of SVB Bank, and we had no some idea that the some events that have unfolded in the last week would happen. But it's especially exciting, I think, for us to have this conversation with the backdrop of these really quite some important events happening around the globe. But we didn't want to get also too kind of distracted by these events, and we wanted the conversation to be one that explores issues of the financial system, of banking across the globe, and the role of emerging markets in that story. The governor and Professor Tooze kindly agreed to kind of present some introductory thoughts, and then we'll kind of take the conversation from there. So let me then immediately pass it to you to kind of get us going with some introductory comments from your side.
Thank you very much. And may I start first by thanking Wits and our host today, and Wiser, who've been my host this week, for the extraordinary generous reception here, and the governor for taking time to be part of this conversation with me. It's an extraordinary honour and privilege, and one I'm cognizant of. So it's really humbling. I do think the current moment is one of considerable drama. We have been waiting, I think, over the last 18 months, haunted by the question, can you tighten interest rates as steeply as the Fed has ended up tightening interest rates? It didn't start with the Americans, it started arguably with the Brazilians, started in the emerging market world. Can you do this? And the phrase was, can you do this with things bending but not breaking? Or to put it another way, what will bend and what will break? There was a lot of very serious anxiety, I think, and for very good reason, about the implications of this huge hike in interest rates for the emerging market, low-income, frontier market world, and we are seeing some of the fallout of that. Sri Lanka, I think, was idiosyncratic, but then every crisis in a situation like this is idiosyncratic. Pakistan, Egypt have been under huge pressure. But I don't think many of us expected that the first really manifest and dramatic break would come in the absolute heartland, the dead centre of the most self-satisfied, most self-congratulatory part of America's by no means modest capitalist political and cultural system. I just don't think we saw that coming. It is a relatively small bank that blew up. The governor was saying over snacks that it's in the 200 billion ballpark. It turns out to matter systemically in the United States for rather different reasons. It's not the size of the balance sheet, it's whose accounts they were holding that is critical. And it's a matter, on the one hand, of political economy in the crudest sense, that these are very rich and influential people, but it is also part of a tech system which is widely understood to be at the heart of America's innovative system. And I gather in the furious lobbying that went in over the crucial weekend, and it is always weekends, we had the Lehman weekend, the Citibank weekend, we now have the SVB weekend. What was also invoked was China. that in a sense America has to bail out and has to rescue this ecosystem, because in the global contestation with China, which dominates American public discussion, both of America's options but also of the wider world, including Africa, this is a key part. This tech system is a key part. And they've done the sorts of things, and we could talk maybe about what the implications are. As a European, I have to say, I am somewhat less surprised by the follow-through, because, as some of you will have gathered, literally overnight, the critical issue was no longer in this obscure part of the American system, but actually at the classic heart of the error-prone, weakened, European, overbanked, over-leveraged system that has been a source of accidents perpetually since 2008. Credit Suisse and UBS had to be bailed out heavily by the Swiss government in 2008, and now we're back. And both the Swiss and the Feds are involved now in really large-scale financial stability operations. The systemic element of this is that both Suisse and SVB are leaking. They're leaking below the waterline because of the damage to the bond portfolios from the interest rate hike, and that's a key component. If you have to actually realize those losses, you're in trouble. You only have to realize them if you face liquidity events. And I think that, if we stand back further to just wrap this opening comment, remains, I think, the fundamental question also for the wider world. I mean, we have seen, both in 2020 and now in this interest rate hiking cycle, a remarkable display of resilience by emerging market economies in particular, and South Africa is a standout case, and the South African Reserve Bank deserves considerable credit for having built the reputation that has given it the ability to resist the storm that it's in. It's not the only central bank in that position, but this is a phenomenon we have to reckon with. The anchors of the global financial system are now definitely multipolar. We all know about the Fed and the swap lines and everything else, but those work because they work on cogs in the system that are high-powered, that are highly credible and highly effective. That is the good news. The bad news is that the pressure is immense, and as in the case of a Credit Suisse, it takes a bad news story, a series of mishaps, and all of a sudden you're in a squeeze which then becomes really irresistible, and the question is who's there to catch you. And in the case of some pieces of the global puzzle, even really, you could say, basket case pieces, which is the kind of pejorative term used in relation to entities like Pakistan, there are coalitions of forces that come into play that will stabilize a state like that. But I think that remains the central concern looking at the current situation. If, on the other hand, of course, the Fed and the other global north central banks pull back from the tightening cycle, then, of course, we have a series of questions about systemic credibility, which are of even wider significance, because then what we're really concluding from the current situation is that there is an interest rate that is necessary to contain inflation, and there's an interest rate which the global financial system can stand, and the two things are not neatly aligned with each other. We're not in the Goldilocks scenario, in other words. And then all bets are off and the equations become very, very complicated, right into the very heart of the system. This is no longer then a question of architecting complicated support and bailout actions for emerging market or frontier actors. This then really does become about the Swiss banks or the American banking system. If you want a prediction on where to look next in the big American banks, it's Bank of America that I think most people think is fragile, has the largest losses, unrealized losses on its portfolio. It has one of the smallest shares of deposits guaranteed by the FDIC. I am not telling you here and now that Bank of America is going to be next in line, but if we have now gotten into the habit of reading those bank balance sheets, that is the one that surprised me most when I looked at the share of deposits guaranteed by the FDIC. It's really quite surprisingly low there, and the losses they have taken on their bond portfolio have shocked many analysts, I think.
Great, and thank you so much for those opening thoughts. Let me then shift straight on to you, Governor, for your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much, Imran, and thanks, Professor Vilakazi, for those opening remarks. And Adam, welcome to our part of the world. Over the past few weeks, I had spent time trying to track what you have been writing about, what you have tweeted about, and what you have been researching. I'm pleased to notice that you mainly retweet rather than generate new tweets, which is always a welcome thing because there's only this much that you can say in a tweet. And thank you very much for setting the scene. The major disruptions since the onset of the pandemic in early 2020 challenged the belief of many that the world had entered a long phase of low and stable inflation. Supply chains, stretched by the staggered reopening of economies, only proved as resilient as their weakest link, resulting in major delivery lags and higher costs in key industries. Labor supply did not adjust automatically when firms began to hire again, and this resulted in tight labor markets. There was no precedent in recent history that we can learn from relating to the policy responses required to the pandemic shock. Even after the economies had reopened, fears of long-term scarring, including bankruptcies and permanent job losses, prompted coordinated responses from governments and central banks to uphold highly stimulative policies. In retrospect, we now know that such stimulus provided excess support to demand at a time when supply was struggling to adjust, compounding inflation. The war in Ukraine, which exacerbated the shock to prices of oil, gas, and some inputs into food production like fertilizers, added to the global inflation problem. Even as in a country like South Africa, where supply constraints did not originate, we still faced price pressures from more expensive imports, shortages of key inputs, elevated shipping costs, and the depreciation of the currency as financial markets repriced the outlook for global interest rates. Worldwide, inflation pressures have forced monetary policy normalization. Policy rates increased quickly as central banks realized that what was thought to be transitory inflation shocks are not as transitory, and there are strong second-round effects. Put simply, transitory had become far longer than what transitory should be. What that transitory should have been is another matter. What is in no doubt is that the world of central bank opinion was divided between those who believed in transitory effects of inflation, and we called them team transitory. And of course, there was another team called team permanent, which said that these shocks are here, they are going to be with us for a long time, and they are going to lead to lasting price pressures. Suffice to say, there isn't a central banker these days who will characterize themselves as belonging to team transitory. So despite the increases, policy rates in many countries, including in South Africa, remain below neutral interest rates, and in some cases, they are actually negatives, meaning nominal interest rates are below reigning inflation rates. So, the COVID crisis and the recovery period reminded us of lessons that we often forget. Lesson number 1. Working together to address global problems leads to effective solutions. The hoarding of vaccines during the crisis meant there were numerous mutations of the COVID-19 virus. It is only once vaccination rates increased across countries that the COVID-19 pandemic was contained. Coordinated global responses accelerated the global recovery. None of us is safe unless all of us are safe. And that is the lesson from the COVID pandemic. Lesson number 2, we need to have policy buffers. Having policy buffers to tackle COVID-19 type pandemics is difficult as they are rare events. This is a once in a century event that takes place. The problem though is that many countries had no monetary or fiscal space to tackle even small crises. In South Africa, we had the space to provide sizable monetary policy stimulus, unlike central banks in advanced economies, which were stuck at the zero lower bound. But we had limited fiscal space, which meant that the Treasury couldn't provide the kind of support that treasuries in the advanced economies could provide. We didn't have the space to do it. Put simply, it was, as the Jamaicans put it was not monkey see, monkey do. Because we couldn't do it, we didn't have the fiscal space to do that. Third lesson, inflation is bad. Inflation is bad. Many governments, including ours, faced mass protests against high inflation and not so much high interest rates in the post-crisis period. Globally, there's a survey done by one of the survey houses showed that there was a general intolerance by the public of inflation on a global level. And we've got to also understand the generational shift that has taken place. There are people who started working or were born 30 years ago and started working after that. They do not know what high inflation is like. They have only lived in an environment of low inflation and low interest rates. And so when inflation rises and the cost of living rises, they are shocked by what they are seeing. And correctly, they are angry that not enough is being done to cap the erosion in the in incomes. And fourth but not, and last but not least lesson, and there could have been many more lessons, but I just picked this for. Borrowing in foreign currency during good times should trigger consideration regarding the ability to pay during hard times. In addition, the cyclicality of commodity revenues makes them an inappropriate source of continuous funding to meet short-term obligations, that is, interest payments on debt. And this country is not running short of those lessons. Every time there is a commodity boom, it does not take us long to start a conversation whereby we pretend that we are actually richer than we actually are. And it doesn't take us long to adjust our expenditure outlays in line with new revenues. And commodity boom after commodity boom, one lesson has been common. The business cycle will always be with us. Prices go up and prices come down. And so it is in the commodity cycle. There are many other lessons which I would not get into. We have got a very good historian here. I'm sure he has got lots of those to share. Suffice to say, the post-crisis period poses many challenges for central banks for dealing with fiscal dominance effects to tackling climate change-related risks. Increasingly, central banks are being asked to address problems that fall directly under the domains of governments without consideration under what conditions and how central banks are effective in achieving their goals. They were designed for one purpose. They have been successful in it. And we think they have been so successful, we can use these central banks to solve all the other problems. Just to sum it up, that societies globally have got an inflated expectation of the ability of central banks to solve the problems that our populations are facing.
Right, thank you so much for those opening remarks. I think it might be good for us to focus into this question that kind of Adam highlighted about the kind of contradictory kind of objectives of kind of trying to manage the problems of inflation through higher kind of interest rates, and the fact that we kind of living in a time when there's a kind of high degree of fragility kind of inside the system, and as kind of Adam said, the kind of the debate is really how far can you push the inflation control envelope without causing a breakage in some other part of the system, and we're starting to see to kind of feel the effects of that in the US and what is the approach of in the emerging economies? So unlike the US, where the labor markets have been applies here. Our levels of unemployment have grown substantially during the crisis, and all of the evidence that we have is that both the kind of household sector, the kind of business sector are under immense pressure. In the South African situation, kind of adding to that is the question of the crisis with Eskom. So in that context, the kind of challenge for central banks in this context is a lot more complex, perhaps, than it has been in the US and in Europe. Any thoughts from you, Adam, on that challenge and kind of how it's been managed in these sectors?
Thank you very much, and thank you for saying the word unemployment, because we slide into euphemism. I mean, when we talk about the global economy bending rather than breaking, the bending bit is the manipulation of the labour market, essentially, or the presumption that you can use interest rates to manipulate, cool down the labour market, as it's conventionally said, which is actually the question of exactly how much unemployment do you need to halt the inflationary, the second-order effects. And the second-order effects are also a euphemism more often than not for various types of indexation or collective action by workers to demand wages to offset the increase in prices. Though that is the hard nub of the political economy of inflation. And in every respect, the problems are much more classic, in a sense, in the emerging market world. Governor, you in fact gave a speech at the BIS where you made this point, that the emerging market economies deal with classic trade-off issues here, because indexation is much more common, because collective bargaining is much more powerful and much more politically potent in a country like South Africa than it is in the United States, where, I kid you not, in the fall of 2021, as inflation accelerated in the United States to historic levels, there was an entire quarter where the most significant labor dispute in the United States was on the campus of my university. Now, when that's the case, you know you're in a post-classical political economy situation. In South Africa, the stakes are massively high, right? In every respect. I guess the question with unemployment is whether or not the unemployment problem in South Africa is best thought of in cyclical terms or in structural terms. And in that case, how one thinks about this relationship. Now, thinking about them as two separate problems can itself be an excuse for inaction. Right? You palm this problem off on structure, and then you don't have to pay any attention to the cyclical effects of hiking interest rates or sustained high interest rates. Of course, that's false, because history, the structure, is a series of short runs, and in the short run, investment decisions shaped by interest rates and investments which are not made have scarring effects too, right? There are long run effects. So that must be an incredibly weighty balance to strike in the command center of the South African Reserve Bank. As classic as it is as a product of 1990s central banking, it's governing an economy which is very unlike that of Europe or the United States in this respect. So in the spirit of the governor's concluding remarks, you need more instruments, right? You can't do this with one instrument. You need other instruments. If everything comes down to interest rates, you're kind of caught on the horns of a dilemma. So I would have thought that in a case, and this is thinking in the spirit perhaps of the wiser group that is thinking about issues of trust and identification, one of the priorities I would imagine, especially also for a central bank interested in financial stability, is the structure of the financial system. Whether or not it actually provides credit, not the price at which credit is provided, but whether or not there are obstacles in the credit system to the provision of credit, for instance, to small-scale entrepreneurs, to folks in the townships who, in an M-Pesa-style system or an ant financial style model in East Asia, have access to various sorts of what we used to call microcredit that would enable entrepreneurship, job creation, and address the structural problem by way of monetary policy, but not in the sense of cyclical monetary policy, the business cycle, where you're caught on this dilemma, but in terms of expanding the range. And it would seem to me that this would be an area, not for the central bank necessarily to substitute, in the manner of the American radicals who now demand that every citizen ought to have a bank account at the central bank, but as a facilitating and supportive actor in the realm of financial innovation, of the various new forms of fintech that I think are one of the leapfrogging shortcuts to innovation in economies like South Africa. You were saying to me that one of the puzzles for you about the South African economy is the small size of its informal sector. You have an unemployment rate of 35%. Something's going wrong in the sense that people are not being enabled to mobilize economically. That's, I think, where you would want this extra instrument, these new facilities, this new vision of what a central bank might be to work. Not in classic favoritism, picking winners, the old school visions of industrial policy, perhaps, which are so open to cronyism, so open to corruption, but in this more broad-based vision of enabling the citizenry financially. And their central banks have, I think, a underexplored, underdeveloped role because they have acted so much through the private financial system. And one of the lessons, and that is understood in relatively conventional terms, in oligopolistic terms eventually, and that, after all, is the scandal of what we're seeing in the United States and Switzerland right now, of government action in a very ad hoc, very targeted, by no means one rule for everyone way, reaching down into the financial system and bailing particular people out. By contrast with that, it would seem to me that a broad-based push for the facilitation of credit across the economy would be much more open-ended and much more compatible with a democratic understanding of what a central bank does for a society at large.
Any thoughts from you, Governor, on that question? What I understand Adam come to be saying is that sometimes perhaps we focus too much interest rate instruments. And that perhaps we, in a society such as ours, we should be thinking a lot more about kind of innovations in the financial system that can really improve access to those who don't, who kind of don't have access, and that fintech space, the microcredit space, perhaps is an area that is underdeveloped in South Africa. So your thoughts on that, and the kind of role of the central bank in kind of in those issues. I do hear you, Governor, that partly my question goes straight into the space where kind of central banks are being asked to do more and more and more. But this area, it seems to me, is in the narrow space of what we would think about as kind of as the role of the role of the central bank.
It's not narrow. It's not narrow at all. And Adam covered quite a space. And let me put this into chunks and deal with it. The first chunk, which had to do with the role of monetary policy in stabilization. That is what it is in essence, because cyclically we can affect growth in the cycle. We can smooth it so that we do not have these booms and busts. It is as much a science as it is an art, because you have got to make particular estimates about what your potential growth rate is, so that you could tell when you are overheating and when you are performing below growth. And one of the discussions that had to do with the level of unemployment. And Adam correctly points this thing that yes, there's a structural component and a cyclical component, but you cannot just make this pure break and as if the two are not linked. They are very much linked, but pumping up on the cyclical side without doing anything structurally will lead to exactly what he was talking about. Something has got to break, and that is where you experience the break. And since we are at a university, one of the more controversial terms in economics, apart when we talked about inflation, and telling whether inflation is on target or not, that we can agree as a society this is the target, and we can tell whether inflation has departed or not. But what is the acceptable level of unemployment, which Adam was referring to, that you are looking at these things, and of course the profession comes with a very difficult term, difficult for people to understand, which they call the NAIRU, right? The non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which basically says that what is the level of unemployment that would be tolerable or that the economy can handle, beyond which, if it goes below that, inflation begins to accelerate. What would that be in South Africa? Well, in the US, they end up having to commission that to the National Bureau of Economic Research to come with what the NAIRU is. We do not have a similar thing here, which makes it for very interesting discourse, because forget that every university will have its own view of what the NAIRU is. In one economics department, you will have as many views of the NAIRU as you have economic professors in that university, which then makes it even more difficult to say a central bank must target a level of employment or a level of unemployment, because we can't even agree what the NAIRU is. And so what does the central bank end up doing? We ended up focusing on the potential growth of the South African economy, and then says that even there, when you talk of the structural issues are going to be, how do you lift the potential growth of the economy? And to lift that potential growth of the economy, there are certain things that we might do. It doesn't matter how quickly our miners can dig iron ore out of the ground. If we can't rail it, it is not going to be sold. And it doesn't matter how much they can try and send people down underground. If we cannot safely bring them back up because we do not have electricity, it's not going to happen. And that explains thus why we have got our own potential growth being so low. And to that you can add the fact that the education system has got to be producing particular sets of skills that the economy needs. And absent that, you are going to have a skills constraint. And Adam, when we are talking about heated labor markets in the advanced economies, and they are having these problems, and just going through the major cities in the advanced economies, we are hiring. Try to book a restaurant in New York or Washington or London. The first thing that flashes is not the menu. The first thing that flashes is, are you looking for a job, right? Because they just cannot have enough people to fill these jobs. South Africa is different. We still have high unemployment levels, but we have got a bifurcated labor market. Those who are highly skilled are able to command a premium that they would not be able to command in other parts of the world. And the reason is that is where we experience the shortage. And there is another part of the labor market, which is a labor market that is populated by people with low skills base and so forth, that is having very high levels of unemployment, and that is the nature that the nature of the labor market that we are faced with, and those are some of the structural issues that we would have to deal with. So that is the monetary policy and employment and unemployment on the one side with respect to inflation. You have raised important issues about central banks having to do other things, and one of the things is creative central bankers are as dangerous as creative accountants. They lead to very unpleasant outcomes. And so, what have we seen? In South Africa, the National Treasury set out the policy framework for the financial sector and set 4 goals of financial sector policy. Amongst those is financial inclusion, the kinds of stuff that Adam was talking about. Financial integrity, to prevent the abuse of the financial sector by criminals and terrorists. We are on a blacklist, on a grey list now, precisely because it was felt that there might be people abusing the financial sector and we might not have done enough. And safe and sound financial institutions. If you think that we shouldn't be focusing on making sure that financial institutions are sound, just check what is happening the other side of the Atlantic. And fourthly, that of preserving financial stability. Now, many of the things that Adam was talking about have to do with financial inclusion, and we can always explore this further. What we have in the central bank was we created an innovation hub, and that innovation hub is made of a number of components: a regulatory guidance unit, a sandbox. This is the term that is used globally. It's called sandbox. But in South Africa, we do not quite use a sandbox. We actually use a sandpit. That is where the children go and play when they grow up. So we create this for children in the financial sector, basically financial innovators, to come and test their ideas there. And thirdly, we have got a learning accelerator where we say to them, okay, this is how the thing is working here. You can go through these things. We can help you accelerate this stuff. And this has provided the space for innovators in the financial sector who are in the main driven by technology to come into the central bank and explore how they could actually deploy their products in that manner. And the point here is you do not ask bureaucrats to innovate. They will stifle innovation, which is why we decided we will set an environment and allow innovators to come into that space.
Great, thank you. Let me, I can see that Adam's dying to respond to some of those issues, so let me pass it straight to you then, Adam.
Well, I was fascinated to see the way in which the governor's mind moved, and it was at the point where we were on the clear distinction between supply and demand and on the potential growth that I waved at you and said, because it does seem to me that thinking of this in terms of financial inclusion, in a sense, puts financial innovation, if you almost in a social policy bucket. Whereas the place that it would belong from the point of view of where your remarks concluded is squarely in the potential growth bucket, right? This is opening the horizon for potential growth, expanding the range of performance. And this is surely where, in a reasonable way, questions about the wider role of credit in society necessarily intrude even into a properly conservative understanding of what central banks do. At some point, one does have to ask oneself, are we generating enough credit and for the right purposes? That question can hardly be resisted, right? And one element of that is, are the right people being able to access credit? But there is also then the question, and this is why the demand, I think, has come from the environmental side, for instance, that central banks need to be key players in the energy transition, because we know there are huge financing needs. I was meeting with people from the Presidential Climate Commission this morning, and their estimate is of a financing need of $90 billion over the next 5 years for a just energy transition in South Africa. And at that point, the distinction between, as it were, the proper role for central banks, the proper role for business, begins to break down, because this is a financing need in the order of 4 to 5% of GDP that has macroeconomic implications. And this is not to say the central bank, therefore, is the agent that can move this. I can promise you the central bank never came up in our conversation. It just was not, it's not on the table. But from the point of view of credit management, and from the point of view of enabling that transition to happen, the level of interest rates, the macroeconomic setting does become critical. And so there, it seems to me that I understand, historically speaking, both where the central banking paradigm of the 90s came out of in Europe and the United States. I grew up in Germany. The Bundesbank is the lead elephant. And I understand, as best as an outsider can, why it's so crucial in the South African context for the central bank to insist on its autonomy and to give a person of your authority the ability to bang on the table about something like Eskom and the railway system. But there is a moment, surely, where but precisely the central bank of a major emerging market economy, a leading member of the G20, Africa's representative in the G20, also has to say there is a historic challenge in front of us here, a whole societal challenge, which we have to figure out our relationship as part of. And simply insisting there on the sort of the mantra of financial stability and price stability, I fear in the end it will become delegitimizing. In an era that demands radicalism, to say never trust a radical central banker feels like, I mean, forgive me for saying it, it feels almost like a cop-out. And I'm not saying your job is incredibly difficult, sir. I fully appreciate that. But there are so many issues impinging on the world right now that sort of conservatism, when German central bankers say it to me, I'll say it to their face, it feels like a cop-out. This is stepping away from the whole societal collective responsibility for addressing the climate challenge. We need all hands on deck in relation to this kind of problem.
It's interesting. We do not ask soldiers to tackle inflation. They have got the wrong instruments. Mm-hmm. The instruments they carry, if we ask them to come and tackle inflation, they might just leave us with other things. Society designs institutions with a particular remit and tasks them with that remit. And it is very important that in the design of institutions in society, even with all hands on deck, that we do not cause confusion in respect of which institution is responsible for what. And I will come back to that just now. I have not seen financial inclusion as a social good. We see it as an economic imperative. Yes. And we set ourselves very aggressive financial inclusion targets. And I've actually spent the best part of my life engaging with activists in the financial inclusion space to say that there is a problem of narrative here. You are trying to reduce financial inclusion to access to credit. Mm-hmm. And that is wrong. It should be access to all financial products that the population should have access to, whether it is credit, it is cheap payment systems. And by the way, just this week, we launched in South Africa a payment platform called PaySharp that will enable people to transmit up to 3,000 rands instantly at almost at such a minimal cost. But that said, I want to come then to your things, and you have said so many of these things, and I'll be happy to explore them further with you, but I wanted to come to the remit. By the way, financial stability, price stability is not like it has been a mantra of central banking. As a matter of course, central banks had ignored financial stability until 2008 set in.
Yes, they didn't take it seriously enough. Yeah.
Except in South Africa. You see, in South Africa, we started to worry about financial stability in 2002 when we experienced a banking crisis in this country, where we had to shut down upwards of 15 banks in this country. That's when we started to take financial stability seriously. We created a financial stability department in South Africa. And actually, the South African Reserve Bank, I was not working there, so I can give the Reserve Bank credit. I was working in the Treasury, were among the pioneers of central banks' responsibilities with respect to financial stability. And that we could do because we had the instruments of financial stability with us. Climate change. What instruments do we have in climate change? We don't. We do not have any. How have we thought about it? Is climate change not an issue for central bank? Of course it's a big issue for central bank. And we've divided it into two buckets. The first bucket had to do with what you were talking about. You want credit to continue to flow. And if we want credit to continue to flow, we must make sure that institutions are robust enough to withstand climate risks. Because if they do not withstand climate risks, and they either disappear or have to be bailed out by the taxpayers, we have a problem. South Africa is no stranger to these climate risks. We have experienced adverse weather conditions, from extreme drought to extreme floods. And sometimes all of them happening in the same year in different parts of the country. And so we think about that, and that is with respect to our financial stability responsibility, that we think about the risks that are posed, that if credit does not flow, intermediation is not taking place, and thus you are not having a financial sector. And by the way, our policy document says a safer financial system that serves South Africa better. So it's not having a good financial system for its sake. It is to make sure that it serves South Africans. And lastly, climate change and the transition, the just transition, poses very particular challenges. We do not know how production processes are going to shape up in the future. We do not know how the price formation is going to evolve in the future. And so central banks have got to come to grips with the implications of climate change. And these issues are complex. I just had to establish a unit to just look at that in the central bank. And then I suddenly realized I should not go to the economics department for that, because now I need climatologists in my team, because they must be able to tell me about these things. These things are complex. Lastly, we have got a responsibility as a central bank to develop the financial sector. And so because we have got a responsibility to develop the financial sector, we have got to also oversee the development of new financial instruments. People are talking about green bonds and all of these things. Clearly, central banks, given that they are constantly introducing new instruments and all that, we have got a role to play in that. But let me pause it there, because so that the exchange can continue to take place.
All right, Adam, back to you. You might want to kind of take up the points that the governors raised about the climate change kind of challenge, and it's an issue that where you shared some of your thoughts on kind of in the previous seminar that we had. Thank you. But it does seem to me that we're kind of in a world where the kind of harnessing of financial resources for this transition is of a substantially kind of higher order than the norm. I mean, I've kind of seen an estimate that says that kind of just for the developing countries, we kind of going to need external financing in the order of $1 trillion per year.
Yes.
In that sort of framework, it does seem to me we have to start to rethink some of the key kind of levers and systems in the international system. But let me then pass it on to you for your thoughts on that and kind of responses to the governor.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to be in such a vigorous exchange. It's really, thank you so much for for being so willing to engage. To me, the crucial break, and it's by no means confined to our conversation, it's the central question, I think, in the conversation between those of us who are focused on the energy transition and the central banking community, is the governor's first move, which was to say, clearly it is at the heart of our central bank responsibility to consider the impact of climate and climate risks on the stability of the financial system. And there we must intervene. And that is the alpha and omega. Mark Carney mapped this out in his historic speech on this issue in front of the Lloyd's shareholders back in 2014. And I think that has been the roadmap. The question that, as it were, we're insistently beginning to ask, and in light of energy transition planning now I think can no longer be avoided, is not so much, as it were, the impact on the credit system of climate change, but the reverse, the impact on climate change of the credit system, right? The risk here is what sorts of industrial and economic development are being leveraged, supercharged, enabled by bank credit. And is it really viable over the next 10 years as society harnesses itself to address this problem? We are asking entire communities to change their way of life, to change their jobs. We're going to be churning millions of people's employment around the world. Is it really, I think, even plausible politically to say, oh, well, we're going to carry on doing, our institutions remain focused on our limited remit. We're going to stay in our lane because, as you say, Governor, this is what we were designed to do. If you take the climate challenge seriously at this level, it's a moment like the 1970s or the post-apartheid period in South Africa, where the constitution of society is in play. And there was a moment, after all, when one of the senior economic advisory teams to the ANC recommended a non-independent banking model for South Africa. This was turned down, and it's not surprising that it was shot down. And I can see the logic of making the choices that South Africa made at that moment. You can see the logic both in terms of conformity to global norms and in terms of domestic concerns about capture. The question in the current moment is whether, if we take the climate change challenge seriously, whether or not we do not have to rethink our organizations at that level, which is crucial because you, as a good servant of your institution in its current form and an upholder of its standards, quite rightly say, no, I stay within these confines, and that is what I am mandated, and it's more than just a narrow thing. It's about upholding the logic of constitutional ordering in a society, hugely under stress. But this is a problem, I think, for institutions very broadly. And in the same way as we have seen, for instance, a lurching move into the industrial policy space by the American government, a real deep reconceptualization of how industrial policy functions, it seems there's something just frankly slightly implausible about the idea that monetary policy can remain outside this turmoil. And it is a question then of shaping new institutions that meet your criterion of stability, of being held accountable, that have clear, precise guidelines, and those being politically legitimated, so that when you and your successors as governor of the central bank say we are fulfilling our mission and staying in lane, that lane has been reshaped by society as a whole. I would deeply agree with you. There's a deep problem in moving without that mandate, in moving without that political that conversation, treating this simply as a technocratic issue of saying, let's find some levers that we might be able to pull, rather than considering the deep constitutional issues that you started with in your observations. And of course, this does face the military all the time. You started with this question of, do we ask soldiers to fight inflation? Well, we don't, of course, but we do sometimes ask them to impose price controls in really stressed societies. We certainly do occasionally ask them to do flood relief. In some societies, when you have an ambulance strike, you mobilize the military. I've actually been at British airports where the passport police struck, and so the military were asked to run it, and they did a fabulous job. And in New York, when I got my first round of Pfizer vaccine, it was in a military-managed vaccine thing, and it was the best and most efficiently operated queue I've ever been in the United States. And so there are ways in which we can, on the other hand, when President Trump asked the American military to appear alongside him in the repression of a Black Lives Matter protest, that clearly is a moment of constitutional breach. So we need to take these boundaries seriously, but we also need to think creatively about the historical moment that we're in. And that, in a sense, I think, is the urgent challenge of the climate discussion right now. One could say it's exaggerated. You could say fundamentally, I think that's overplaying it. This is too much. But I think that is the level at which your response, your vigorous response of the status quo, really, that's where you push us to, in a sense, in the challenge.
Yeah, Adam, that's a very interesting take because the situations you are referring to were almost like dealing with the immediate crisis, but let's not, because it was an analogy which I thought that would be more useful. Here comes my challenge. This country faces massive poverty. Why recast the role of the central bank to focus on climate change and not on poverty? This country faces unemployment. Why recast the mandate of the central bank to focus on climate change and not on unemployment? This country faces a number of other challenges, whether it is education, it's electricity, and it's water. And the reason I am making these things is not to minimize the point, is to try and say society designs institutions to deal with particular areas, and central banking is no exception. And actually, the evolution of central banking itself shows that the role of central banks had changed in history. Those who might not know, the South African Reserve Bank Act still has in it that the directors of the Reserve Bank, one must have a background in mining, one must have a background in agriculture, one must have a background in industry, one must have a background in finance. It all had to do with an era where central banks used to do directed lending and all of that. That said, there is a discourse here that is actually taking place with respect to climate change. Climate change is here with us, and it is a risk. And we need to mobilize these things. But I want to up the gear because your work has so much also been about Europe and elsewhere. You see, we faced a problem here of electricity. This session had to start 5 minutes late because there had to be a transition from one energy source to another, right? And it had to start a little bit late with respect to that. And it is because we have got a shortage of generation capacity. Our energy is very much based on coal because that is the resource that we have. And as part of the just energy transition, we made these commitments, and we are going to be facing our coal-fired power stations over a period of time. We are going to be greening our economy and so forth. Enter Russia in Ukraine. Europe says it is concerned about its own energy security. South Africa, please send us the coal. That is what was happening. We experienced a situation where in some of the European countries, South Africa's coal exports to those countries were up 70%. And we say, but there is a transition here. They said, we have got energy security, as if we do not have energy security issues in South Africa. So the discourse from the advanced economies have also got to be honest. Secondly, We are still in the transition, and we are producing goods in this country that are using the energy that is deemed to be dirty. And when our goods get into the European area, there is going to be a special tax for those goods to get in there. We are talking about a just energy transition. Ditto, the US is talking of the Inflation Reduction Act. What a choice of an act, because you see, we say that the focus is climate change, but they didn't call it a climate change act.
No.
It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. Part of it is that they realize that there are things that must be done, which, if not dealt with respect to climate change, inflation will actually be going up. Guess what? They said unashamedly, they are putting these things, and all the resources they are going to put are for the benefit of the American firms, and they are not ashamed. And mark my words, Europe will have no choice. Europe is going to respond in that way, and China will respond in that way, and very soon everybody will be trying to respond in that way. And if you are a small open economy like ours, you do not have the measures to punish all of those countries. It will be like cutting your nose to spite your face, right? And so this discourse and the just energy transition, is very important that we are honest with each other. You can't walk away from the climate change discussions because we have got one planet. We have got one planet. If others continue to pollute this planet that we call ours, which we have borrowed, by the way, from our children and our grandchildren, will be under as a result of those climate things. But I agree with so many of the things that you have said. I just thought that I must put this in this context.
And absolutely rightly, because I think the hypocrisy of the Europeans on this issue screams to high heaven. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. It totally defies belief, I believe, that the EIB is pursuing the total blockade of gas development in Africa, given the way in which Germany's most enlightened and progressive ministers will literally boast of the fact that they chased down every LNG cargo in the world and snapped it up for Germany, which basically means depriving Bangladesh of affordable gas deliveries and putting the lights out there. It is to put it as forcefully as you have, is exactly what the spokespeople for South Africa should be doing, and relentlessly, and calling the global North's hypocrisy what it is. It is intolerable and shouldn't be allowed to stand. And I hope nothing I've said suggests my view is in any way different from that. To my mind, South Africa is in the position in which really the green energy transition is purely win-win. And the extraordinarily impressive South Africans I was sitting with this morning said, well, yes, there is this 8.5 billion, deal that the Europeans and the Americans are making for us, but A, the money's not real, and B, we need to own this for ourselves. This is a national priority for South Africa, for the reasons which are perfectly obvious. It is a win-win business proposition. This country is blessed with some of the most extraordinary conditions for both solar and wind power development. You have the possibility of a globally competitive hydrogen sector. You have neighbors that could really be highly complementary. Mozambique has already done the gas development the region needs. Namibia is already in advanced talks with the Europeans. South Africa has, through the apartheid era, ASAT's programs, all of the in-house hydrogenation and high-pressure chemistry expertise that this part of the world needs. You should be part of the battering ram that uses this historic opportunity, because it's not just a climate challenge, it's also a historic opportunity to rebalance the global economy and a window of opportunity for Africa to seize the chance to rechange the terms of trade. And those are rare, and they're few and far between. And there is a tragic history of those deals going the wrong way. So the more assertive the South African government can be, and do not be afraid, do not underestimate the extent to which the Europeans and the Americans need a deal that works on South Africa. The Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa it truly is an exemplary project at the global level. They came away from COP26 knowing that they needed some sort of a deal. It is the one thing that everyone touts. The White House was tooting its horn about this plan only last weekend with Ursula von der Leyen and Biden. They were swamped by Silicon Valley. South Africa has considerable leverage in this conversation because you are too big to fail. You are too big to fail in this conversation as far as global green energy development goes. I couldn't help, sort of smiling, indeed somewhat laughing, when you said, sir, South Africa has other big problems. Maybe the central bank ought to be addressing those. Maybe poverty ought to be part of the brief of the central bank. And I think I understand the reasons why it isn't. But to hear your mind crunching on that problem and opening it up and exposing it, I think is hugely productive, historically speaking. I mean, if I may quote if you ask why, for instance, the United States has a dual mandate for its central bank, one reason structurally is it's the monetary hegemon. So it can indulge in a much wider mandate for its central bank than a peripheral player like South Africa, which plays within much narrower confines than that. The United States can easily pursue multiple objectives with its monetary power. But the other reason America has a dual mandate is the mobilization of the civil rights movement of the 1960s around the question of African American poverty. And from the 1960s onwards, in the second wave of the civil rights movement, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, the Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, and a huge wave of civil rights activists shifted to the agenda of poverty alleviation. Because the March on Washington at which MLK makes his I Have a Dream speech is a march for jobs as well as votes. It's a march for jobs. And that echoes through the 1970s in the mobilization within the Democratic Party of the left wing of the party and the Black Caucus. And it's out of that the Humphrey Hawkins Amendment arises, which indeed mandates the Central Bank of the United States to pursue a policy of maximum employment consistent with inflation. Now, that's a movable feast, as Paul Volcker immediately demonstrated in 1979, where he sacrificed manufacturing employment, many of those jobs held, of course, by African Americans, to the imperative of bringing inflation down and stabilizing the dollar. But it has created in the minds of American central bankers a much broader space for conversation than one would generally credit. The point I'm making is simply, central banking, I think, does need to be understood as a historically moving institutional structure. The choices we make about what it does and what it doesn't do have to be assessed in pragmatic and technical terms. What tools do we have and what tools do we don't have? But they really do go to quite profound political and constitutional level. And in the case of a society like South Africa, faced with the problems that it does, I think your rhetorical question should be taken extremely seriously. It should not be treated merely as a kind of demonstration of the impossibility going there. On the contrary, it should be treated as a standing insistence that in the face of this huge problem which demands treatment, we, for very particular reasons, insisted on this limited mandate. And that argument, I think, needs to be constantly made and constantly justified because the trade-offs here are, tragic in their significance. An entire generation of people, of young people in particular, struggling to find their foothold in the labor market. This is a huge burden of responsibility for economic policymakers to bear. And presumably, no one can afford to sort of just cleave to institutional, sort of the narrow fidelity to an institutional mandate in the face of those kind of imperatives. And the political pressures that will build up in South African society as a result of those, because the central bank mandate is a period of, as it were, relative political optimism about democracy in South Africa, and the situation now is obviously much more complex, as it is in the United States and Europe as well, on these issues. That 1990s framing of what central banks are for in its broader political context goes hand in hand with a sense that, as it were, there's democracy's triumph is quite evident, and we know where we're headed, and therefore, as it were, trade-offs that go to fundamental issues like employment and poverty can be reserved and separated from decisions about monetary policy. And I'm, as a historian rather than as an advocate, I'd be very surprised if that 1990s compromise holds much further into the 21st century.
Well, that's an interesting one. Just 3 points, really. I mean, it's right, I'd raise these things as rhetorical questions, but I was basically trying to say that society must design institutions to deal with all of these things. Because you see, there is one enemy of progress in South Africa. And whenever you hear public servants say, we want a comprehensive, well-coordinated policy, you know we are going nowhere, okay? Because that is an excuse of putting everything in there, right? So I know I will get into trouble, but I will just give you, I will not say which program. But we have identified a program. This is what we want this program to do. We are going to move this bottle from here to there. But we are going to decide that in moving this bottle from here to there, we are going to empower the flower and the speaker so that they could also get there, right? And then we will come with all sorts of things, and we overload the process of moving this bottle from here to there with so many other policy calls. And that is my caution. And so we have a central bank, which by the way, you said narrow. We're not narrow. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa says we must pursue price stability in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth in the Republic. They were students of history, the authors of our Constitution. And when they put that, they understood that balanced and sustainable growth cannot be without price stability. But they also understood that price stability is only one contributor to balanced and sustainable growth, and that you've got to bring all the other institutions of society into this thing. So, very useful, constant discussion about institutions. Just one last word of caution. Institutions in a democracy matter. Quality institutions with clear mandates matter even more. Just in case South Africans forget, think of how our institutions were repurposed in the era of state capture and served something else other than what we had designed them for. So we must be careful what we wish for, because we might just get it. Secondly, in framing that thing in the Constitution of Balanced and Sustainable Growth, and so you mentioned that there was some group of ANC advisors who advised against an independent central bank and they were overruled. Well, I happened to have been an ANC economic activist at the time, not an advisor, which meant that I had to say to the political leadership, this is what ought to be done. And I happened, as a very militant youngster, go to Germany to prove why central bank independence is a mad idea, only to come back to say that if we are ever to succeed in this country, we better have an independent,
you yourself went through
independent
this.
central bank. And I wasn't alone. South Africans, in case you forget, go back to 2017 and see the efforts of capturing the Reserve Bank that tried to repurpose the Reserve Bank to serve the state capture project. Try and remember how the mandate to license banks in South Africa was being concocted to be removed from the central bank so that money laundering in this country can take place. And so, throwing all of these things at the central bank in an esoteric engagement that institutions evolve, and therefore we can throw all of these things, we must be careful. That is what I wanted to say. And lastly, I'm not quite a student of the Fed, but I spend a lot of time talking to them. They do not have a dual mandate. It reads something like this. They must promote price stability, maximum employment. There is a third one you didn't mention. And low long-term interest rates. It's in there.
Yes.
And they do not talk about it. Low long-term interest rates. And in that low long-term interest, the point of departure for a long-term interest rate is what your inflation rate is. And it's all buried in there. I guess I am saying this to re-emphasize your point, that all of these things reflect a contestation in society about the role of institutions.
So let me pass it back to you, Adam. But I think the governors neatly kind of created the kind of opportunity for us to move back into the international issues and the issues about the Fed. And kind of back to the crisis that we're dealing with, that we're dealing with today. So, in kind of answering or kind of responding to the governor, can I ask you to take us back then to well, what is happening today, and what that says for kind of questions of how we should manage interest rates and inflation. I also want to give our audience the chance to kind of engage with you. So kind of after your response, I'm going to take some questions from the room and from those online. The Governor and Professor Tooze can then respond to those, and we're going to have to close by about 10 to 2, kind of at the latest. So back to you, Adam.
This has been such a fascinating exchange and gone so deep, and thank you for being so willing to be so frank. And I'm struggling to see how we can sustain that level into the international conversation. But essentially, the world monetary system has this odd logic that it is made up of central banks, as the governor spelled it out so forcefully at the end there, that each one of which is in a sense the result of societal struggle over institutional roles. But they are inserted into a global system, which is the creation, essentially, leftists would say, of American hegemony and the fact the Americans have the biggest aircraft carriers. I think there is an element of that there, and that too has a political and societal dimension. But I find it a very short-sighted way of understanding how the dollar system works globally, because that's what we're talking about here. These national central banks are inserted into a dollar system. There is an element of military power that undoubtedly goes with this. Whether or not you get a swap line depends on whether or not you belong, a Fed swap line, whether you belong, broadly speaking, within the ambit of American power. Various countries have asked for them and been denied them. I think they did it partly provocatively. When Russia asked for a Fed swap line, they know they're going to get turned down, but they kind of think they'd like to know for certain, right? But beyond that, what holds this together is the unnegotiated, societally non-consensual development of global capitalism. Right? Those moves that banks make globally, the hedging, the choices with regard to currencies within which they operate take place in a space that is to a very considerable extent essentially beyond the scope of any kind of explicit societal organization. But the effect of that is the extraordinary scene that we've seen since 2021, where decisions made in the United States on the fine balance of the very smallest details of the American labor market, which then decide whether the Fed moves 25 basis points or 50 basis points. And if you listen to, one of these, these highly, finely tuned American central bankers, they're like wine connoisseurs. I'm feeling this labor market number has got kind of a good opening, but I don't kind of quite like the body of this. I'm feeling this is more a 25 basis point rise than it's bizarre, and yet the entire global monetary system hinges on this. And it hinges on this because of the balance sheets of the private actors that have meshed this system together, like the big banks, like Credit Suisse, like Standard, that tie us all together. And this isn't consensual on the American side. I mean, American taxpayers didn't sign up to be the global monetary hegemon and have their monetary policy significantly ranged by this. But that is the weird world that we live in. And we have seen a stress test of this system. And it turns out, and this goes back to the, California, those people have a rather important voice, it turns out, in the societal bargain over what central banks do. Right? It turns out that when that happens, and there's 1,000 of them bullying an assistant secretary in the Treasury, apparently that was the guy who went to meet the venture capitalists. They didn't send Yellen. They sent somebody 2 tiers down. And they spelled out to him that something had to happen, right? But that's where these structures, really bite. And it is, I think that's another reason why the governor's vigorous defense of national logics is in some senses, I think, extremely welcome, because it's welcome not just from a national point of view. The sophistication in which the argument is made is deeply impressive. There's also a sense in which the weird ad hoc, unnegotiated nature of the global system is not accountable to logics in which people who are authorized by democracies under constitutional rules. There's no constitution of the world where it says the Fed is the lender of last resort to the banking system for the better benefit of everyone. There's no opening line like that in any global constitution. And to that extent, I think there's another reason why the development of space, you referred to this as like the room for maneuver with regard to fiscal and monetary policy, it's important not just in a technocratic sense, it's important in a normative sense, that actually is a legitimated form of sovereignty, even if it's impaired, even if it's constrained. And that, I'm trying to translate the conversation we were having about the domestic to the national, the international. And I think this is the level at which that conversation needs to be had. One can protest about it. Like, Rajan at the Central Bank of India during the taper tantrum banged the table and said, look, the emerging markets need help. And that kind of argument, I think, is very valid. But the self-strengthening and the development of resilience has got to start in powerful national regulatory authorities. And that is one of the good news stories of the last 2 to 3 years, that we have seen that resilience being played out. And I think that amplifies the stakes of this conversation, because there is no global constitutional project. There should be. Clearly there needs to be one, because de facto there is a realm of monetary power that is global. But as close as we get is sophisticated conversation at the BIS and the appointment of folks of the quality of the governor here to key roles in the IMF structure. That is as close as we get to an argument globally about this fundamental question of the constitution of money.
Great, Adam. Thank you. Let me then at this point open it up to any reflections or questions from kind of anyone. I see a question at the back. I'm going to take the lesson that you get the best quality kind of interventions if you start with a woman. So at the back there.
Thank you very much. I hope that I'm audible. I'm Obilen Kize, a Master of Finance candidate at the School of Economics and Finance. And my reflection or question rather is particularly to the governor. I know that he's gone in depth on this, but I'm still grappling with this. But when you mentioned why focus on the role of the central bank to deal with climate change instead of poverty and unemployment, in 2004, the United Nations and other organizations came together and published Who Cares Wins. And from there, we've come to see concepts such as the triple bottom line, as well as ESG, increase in popularity, particularly because they bring together people, profits, and the planet. So when we speak on issues such as poverty and unemployment, these link directly to the people component or the social component of these concepts. And I strongly believe that we should not divorce climate change and other environmental issues from the socioeconomic matters that you have raised. So I'd just like clarification as to why that particular stance when we are able to work around ways in which we can cater for all three these pillars and work towards sustainable development. Thank you.
I think it might make best sense for us to deal with one question at a time. So let me pass it on to you,
Well,
Governor.
I would say that I agree. We've got to deal with all three. It's, the point is well made. Why I was raising all of these other points, I wanted to dissuade South Africa from what I had called single issue movements. So in South Africa, depending on the period and on the year, there might be a big movement on pit toilets. There might be another movement on hospitals. Then there would be another movement on education. And so there are all of these single issues that come up. And being involved in policy is to be able to take these things and say that there must be a trade-off. And the problem we have as a society is that we think that we can have plenty of everything. And students of economics will tell you the only reason why economists exist is precisely because we are constantly grappling with the issue of we have got these unlimited needs and wants, but the means to meet them are actually limited. And so it is very important in society that government, as almost a leader of society, that government frames for society what the trade-offs are and informs society what choices government is making, bearing in mind the choices government is making might be wrong, and that is also our problem. In that if we have made a choice and we discover it's wrong, instead of saying it was a wrong choice, let us go and look at something else, we repurpose it. It's consistent with the dead horse theory, right? So the horse is dead and we set up a committee to study the horse, or we invest in a new whip to get the horse to go on. So instead of saying this doesn't work, let us get rid of it and focus on something else. And most of the time, you will find that we actually have a conversation that focuses on things that are actually working and how we actually almost want to get them not to work rather than getting them to work better. And that is the tragedy that we face in our society. We do not seem to understand trade-offs. And it's very important, and given that I'm in an academic institution here, it's very important in the discourse that society understands that trade-offs that are made, and for those trade-offs to be framed for society.
We have a kind of a large audience online, and I want to kind of move to the online audience. I'll then come back to you, Gilad. But I'm gonna ask Julia to pick out a question from the online audience.
Thanks very much. So there's a question here for the governor, which is that several African countries, for example, Kenya, are facing severe foreign currency shortages as a result of dollar strength. What is the role for central banks in open markets in resolving this issue?
Governor?
Thank you very much. It's an old back question. You've got to understand what the source of the problem is. And I've not had conversations with the governor of Kenya, but the only time that you face foreign exchange shortages is because your exchange rate is mispriced. And you are trying to hold on to an exchange rate that you can't defend. I don't say that is the case in Kenya. It might be, it might not be. But South Africa is not facing a shortage of foreign exchange. Why? It's not because we have got an abundance of foreign exchange. It's because we have got a flexible exchange rate which reprices every time there is a movement of foreign exchange. When foreign exchange comes in, the currency appreciates. When a foreign exchange goes out, the currency depreciates. And so in our policy framing, we said that we are using the exchange rate as a shock absorber. And Adam talked about this dollar environment that we are faced with. And again, you know, the US can run debt to GDP ratio of 100%. They can run that. They finance in the dollar and everybody wants to invest in the dollar and the money keeps on going there. And when the Fed decides that they are going to buy US Treasury bonds and they do these things, other people elsewhere in the world say, oh, our central banks must also do the same. Well, you do not have the dollar in your pocket. And so you could try and do that. The punishment comes through the exchange rate. And that is what you face. But there are many countries. I mean, Adam earlier on mentioned Pakistan, mentioned Sri Lanka as countries that are facing shortages of foreign exchange. And in the case of Pakistan and Sri Lanka, it's not just a shortage of foreign exchange, it's also that they can't service their foreign currency denominated debt. I don't think Kenya has that problem. They do not have a problem of foreign currency denominated debt. But these shortages you will be having. But Adam had raised it. Why the dollar? Why don't people hold other currencies?
Can I ask you to come in on on this question, Adam?
Yeah. I think the governor made the connection just in passing at the end, which I think is vital here, which is that the flexible foreign exchange rate is an obvious shock absorber to use from a macroeconomic point of view. It has macro-financial stability implications if you have large balance sheets, either public or private, with currency mismatch. And then all of a sudden, currency shortage is essentially the macroeconomic misnomer, because essentially a country can have a currency shortage only if the fixed exchange rate is wrong. But from the point of view of private balance sheets, you can very easily find yourself then in really serious issues. And that is the strategic significance over the long run of moving to domestic borrowing as far as possible, the development of local capital markets, and then the offloading of the currency risk involved in those to foreign lenders who may be local, maybe purchasers of local assets denominated in local currency. That will amplify the things on the fluctuations on your exchange rate, because the foreign lenders could be very large foreign lenders, and small movements in their balance sheets could induce very large swings in an emerging market economy. But it moves the risk around. And this has been one of the essential policy learnings of the new regime since the 1990s, this move to flexible exchange rates, and then a macroprudential focus on balance sheets is absolutely key. Why people use the dollar? People use the dollar because some people use it for political reasons, but the vast majority of people use the dollar because American financial institutions are deep. The dollar is globally fungible. Huge and important commodity markets are denominated in dollars. And if you're in the inner core, if you're a key player in the Brazilian economy or the Mexican economy, you know that your central bank has a dollar swap line. And so in a system like that, the logic is very obvious. It can, of course, also be the logic of a certain sort of offshoring of wealth. It can be the logic of moving yourself to a position of safety outside your national currency system. And we see that logic at work as well. And that's where I think regulatory authorities, this is where new instruments have to be brought into play, and where the grey listing issues are absolutely serious, because there can be essentially very damaging logics involved in dollarization. We see that across the developing world, but also in economies like Argentina.
Over to you, Gilad.
Excellent, thanks very much. My name is Gilad Isaacs. I'm the director of the Institute for Economic Justice think tank in South Africa. An observation and a question for Adam. Early on, Adam, you mentioned the distinguish between cyclical and structural, and also you mentioned how one can use the structural issues as an excuse not to act on the cyclical, which is exactly what happens here. I was in Parliament last week, and we were told that because of electricity and railways, the 162 billion rand cut in expenditure would have no impact, because there's these structural features. And when that argument won't hold on a monetary level, as we've heard now, then it's about Nauru, as if that matters in an economy with a third of the people unemployed, or it's about undermining the institution of the Reserve Bank. And then there's a trump card of, well, if we change our mandate, it's corruption, right? Which then scares everyone, as if widening the mandate of the Reserve Bank leads to some sort of capture. What I want to ask you, and these are all arguments made to then stay in one's lane, right? And those of us who argue for a slight broadening of that lane receive these pushbacks. You have explained in a number of ways some ways in which the lane needs to be broadened, but not necessarily unpacked other instruments which one might. For instance, preferred lending to a development bank, which is hardly a sort of radical policy. So I don't know if you could maybe just unpack some of the instruments which would facilitate in a way that maintains stability, which we all want, but allows for those types of interventions.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. And the governor is no doubt better placed than me to explore the full range of instruments that might be relevant in the South African case. But just sort of to expand the imagination, let me give two examples from other countries of the range of instruments that central banks might employ. So, for instance, France stands out globally as the one country which doesn't have a green energy problem in its electricity sector because it has a massive nuclear fleet. That nuclear fleet was built in the 70s and 80s, was an explicit interest rate subsidy from the French central bank. The French central bank did this under a classic conception of state sovereignty, in which the Central Bank of France is an integral part of the French state. This was the priority of the French state, and so therefore it prioritized the priorities of the French state. The French constitution had to be modified in the early 1990s to create a divided sovereignty under which the French National Bank was no longer an integral part of the French Republic, so that it could become an institution of the Eurozone. Because from the French Republican point of view of indivisible sovereignty, much rather different from your conception of needing to, as it were, separate and parcel out sovereignties and institutions, they needed to make that change. Think about the American mortgage market. The largest single asset class in the world is American real estate. Full stop, hands down, the largest single asset class. The entire system is rigged by a double backstop through the GSEs and then through the discounting and repoing of GSEs by the Federal Reserve, as though they were the equivalent of treasuries. When we say Silicon Valley Bank held loads of treasuries, what it actually held was huge quantities of agency debt, which is the American public backstop to the American housing stock. So in the American case, greening housing, which is a key element, one of the really hard to abate components in the energy transition, in a sense, if the government doesn't act to change the terms of mortgages such that they are building sustainable and requiring sustainable living, the government is directly involved, whether it likes it or not, in perpetuating the status quo of a dirty housing sector. 70% of which it underwrites through a tacit guarantee. Now, I don't want to comment on the specifics of the balance sheet of the South African Reserve Bank, but historically speaking, central banks have been up to their necks in various type of non-neutral intervention in credit markets. Now, you can hand this off, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate way of doing this, to a national development bank. The Germans do this with the KfW. You can do this in a variety of different ways that as it were, minimize the institutional risk, which I do think one should take seriously. But historically speaking, this window in which the bank has the mandate as narrow as the South African Reserve Bank is really very, very recent. I mean, the governor was saying this to me himself earlier on, that like this issue of price stability in the South African case as recently as the 1980s, the apartheid regime was playing fast and loose with the independence of the central bank to obtain electoral boosts that it wanted. So the imagination could be open here, I think. And housing, long-range investment in electrical infrastructure, all of these would be projects where I feel there's a huge amount of governance risk when you go down the line, but it doesn't seem to me that the autonomy of the central bank is the thing I would worry about there most. What I would worry about most is the design of the contracts, so on and so forth. If South African society says we prioritize this, it would seem to me that the financial side of that equation is the least of your concerns.
Imraan, just quickly. Yeah. In terms of the instruments, Lionel is gone. But let's not forget how South African state is configured here. We have got an industrial development operation whose job it is to fund industrialization. We have got the Development Bank of Southern Africa, whose job it is to fund municipal infrastructure. We have got the Land and Agricultural Bank, whose job it is to fund agriculture. We have got the National Housing Finance Corporation, whose job is to fund housing. So it's not like we didn't think about these things. These things were designed. How do they then link up into the central bank? What we provide for in the central bank is an implicit subsidy to the cost of the funding of those institutions, because they issue bonds and their bonds are accepted as collateral at the central bank. And because they're accepted as collateral, institutional investors hold those bonds and that makes their funding cheaper. So in the discourse, when we talk about these things, it's very important to think about what we are talking about. And lastly, it is not a scarecrow to say that the Reserve Bank was targeted by proponents of state capture. Be alive to that. Be alive to that. It was very much so. And when we raised it and we said that our mandate emanates from the Constitution, was not a scarecrow. The Constitution is a covenant that the people of this country entered into, the contract that he is talking about. And if the society decides to change that contract, it's all well and good. Constitutions change, and sometimes they are difficult. Ask the Chileans, they tried to change and they are still at trouble. Again, it can become a fairly difficult and complex process. And in that wedding of the change of the constitution, the mandate of the central bank, were other naughty things that were loaded in there of what they called the abolishment of the fractional banking system that were wedded into all of those things, that the licensing of banks was the South African banks were held by their own government for implementing this government's laws to protect this country against grey listing. The banks were held by this government. And so we must not then pretend that in this society that there are contestations. Yes, there are, but there are also evil forces that want to take our democracy down the dark lane.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question from Keith Breckenridge. Right. Let me then. Okay, so I've kind of allowed one last question, so I'm going to take the one at the back there.
It's just, it looks like America's kind of been able
If you could just speak into the mic, please.
It looks like America's kind of been able to prevent chaos, but do you think in the next couple months we'll see other countries go into similar problems with their banks, and maybe countries that don't have the backup that America has to prevent it in a way that they've managed to do, or looks like they might have been able to do? Is that...
It's probably easier for me to answer that question than you. Yeah. I think what we've learned is that it will pay for everyone to take a long, hard look at the balance sheets of the respectively top 20, top 10, top 5 financial institutions in whatever country you happen to be in, and to ask relatively straightforward and simple questions of a bank stability point of view, because it appears that some folks have been asleep at the wheel. And so I wouldn't confidently predict this question one way or the other, but I must say that my confidence in US regulation is profoundly shaken. There are charts specifically with regard to FDIC cover in which Silicon Valley Bank screams out as an egregious example of risk. And if you then ask one further question, like what is the asset side of their balance sheet like, you were even more concerned. And if you ask then a third question, which is, all of this is immediately available from their regularly returned balance sheets, have they hedged? Again, there's nothing there on that bank's balance sheet. And it is simply incomprehensible to me. And I know from European Central Bank colleagues in the position of the governor who have had words over the weekend at the BIS with their American colleagues, and apparently the Americans don't have very good answers to the obvious question, which is, what on earth were you doing? And that at that level, I think, the governor has very powerfully evoked the threats of political forces that circle around central banks. But I think we should also be just asking ourselves quite elementary questions of competence, of due diligence, of procedure, of just doing the basics right. And this system is too finely balanced. This system in modernity is a constant battle of crisis fighting. We cannot afford this kind of screw up.
I think that's a perfect point at which we can then close. I have a few thank yous to do. Firstly, I'd just like to thank Standard Bank for supporting the university with a chair in kind of African futures and finance, and it's through that chair that Adam's here with us this week. There are a whole lot of colleagues at Wits who kind of assist us to make all of these things happen, from the comms team to the IT team to the events team to those who put it all onto the website, to those who make sure that we can stream it, etc. I'm going to miss someone if I try to go through it all. So I just, you know who you are. Thank you all for the fantastic work that you do to support us. I think I do need to single out Keith Brackenridge. I think Adam would not have been here if it was not for Keith. I want to thank the governor. I think there's a lot about South Africa that we should feel pessimistic about, but there is one fantastic quality that I think gives me great optimism, and that's our policy makers are quite prepared to debate with us robustly, are quite prepared to make themselves available to the university community, and I think the governor's a fantastic example of that strength of our society. Thank you so much, Governor. To the governor's team who kind of assisted us with making this event possible. And lastly, Adam, thank you so much. I think you and the governor helped us to kind of traverse a set of issues about the global economy, a set of issues about our institutions and the strength of those, kind of set of issues about the big global challenges that we face today. So thank you so much, Adam, for this event and for all that you've done in the last week. And finally, thank you all, those online and those who are here. Thank you so much for joining us. With that, I think I'll close the event today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I normally come to Colombia in April.
For the spring meeting, will you be in New York?
Yeah. No. Well, this time I'm not going to be, but Guillermo Carvalho always organized something for central bankers. He runs that institute. Institute of International something, but at Columbia.